village where my grandparents lived felt like a world apart, nestled 60 miles from the city where I spent most of my days. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, almost like it had forgotten to move forward. I remember the long, winding trips during the summer holidays, leaving behind the noisy city streets and gradually entering a realm of endless green fields, thick forests, and that familiar, comforting silence that only a remote village can offer. This village was more than just a place. It was a piece of my childhood. Small and close-knit, it had around 70, 80 houses, each one with its own story. My grandparents, like most of the villagers, had lived there their entire lives, tending to the land, raising their animals, and following the same routines that had been passed down through generations. The air was always thick with the scent of freshly turned earth, mingling with the sweetness of wildflowers that grew along the banks of the wide river cutting through the village. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, the villagers would gather. Some would sit by the river, their old hands deftly casting fishing lines into the water, while others would play cards or chat in the shade of the ancient trees that dotted the landscape. For them, these moments of leisure were sacred, a time to unwind after a long day's work, to laugh, and to remember. For me, those summer visits were pure magic. I would spend my days running through the fields, climbing trees, and exploring every nook and cranny of the village, feeling like I was in my own secret world. The village was my playground, and my grandparents' stories were the soundtrack to my adventures. But there was something else, something unspoken that lingered in the air, especially as the sun set. The village, with all its beauty and tranquility, seemed to hold secrets, whispers of things I didn't fully understand. A little away from the village, where the fields began to stretch out endlessly, there stood an old large house. It was the kind of house that seemed out of place, too grand and too isolated for such a small village. A family lived there, though they weren't well connected with the rest of the villagers. People rarely spoke of them, and when they did, it was always in hushed tones, as if there was something about that family, about that house, that was better left unmentioned. The house itself was a mystery to me. From a distance it looked imposing, almost as if it were watching over the fields and the village. Its windows were always dark, and the fields around it were overgrown, as if nature was slowly reclaiming the land. I would sometimes catch glimpses of movement near the house shadows, flitting behind curtains, or figures walking near the edge of the property, but no one ever seemed to go there, and no one ever seemed to leave. I was endlessly curious about the house and its inhabitants. Despite my relentless inquiries, my grandparents and the villagers would always change the subject when I brought it up. The tension in their voices and the uneasy glances they exchanged whenever the topic arose were enough to tell me that the house and its residents were a matter best left untouched. One particular detail about the house piqued my curiosity. Even further, on new moon nights, I would see two women leaving the large, mysterious house. They would emerge quietly, their movements deliberate and shrouded in secrecy. Each woman carried a covered basket, its contents concealed by a cloth. The basket swayed gently as they walked, their steps barely making a sound on the damp earth. The women moved with careful grace, their paths illuminated only by the soft flickering glow of lanterns they carried. The light from the lanterns cast long, eerie shadows on the ground, making the fields and trees around them seem to shift and writhe in the darkness. I would watch from a distance, hidden among the trees or behind thick hedges, trying to remain unseen. The air was always thick with anticipation and the occasional rustle of leaves as the women walked purposefully through the darkened fields. Their destination was a small cemetery located a little way from the village, near the river. This cemetery was ancient, its gravestones weathered and cracked with age. The cemetery's entrance was overgrown with vines and brambles, giving it an air of neglect and forgotten memories. The graves, some partially sunken or obscured by wild grass, seemed to merge with the surrounding forest, making the entire area feel as if it was part of another world. I often wondered what the women did once they reached the cemetery. Each time I tried to follow them, the darkness and the secrecy of their actions thwarted my efforts. I would creep closer, my heart pounding in my chest, but the heavy night air and the dense foliage seemed to conspire against me, keeping me hidden but always too far away to see clearly. The women would disappear into the shadows of the cemetery, and I would be left with a sense of haunting curiosity and unease. The ritual of their visits, the way they moved with such purpose, and the secrecy surrounding their actions made the cemetery seem even more enigmatic. It was as if the place held a dark secret, something tied to the old house and its mysterious occupants, a secret that was just beyond my reach but ever present in the whispers of the village. On one particularly dark new moon night, I decided to follow them more closely than before. I crept along behind them, careful to stay in the shadows and keep my footsteps silent. As they approached the cemetery, I found a hidden spot among the dense undergrowth where I could watch them unobtrusively. The women stopped at a large banyan tree standing at the edge of the cemetery. Its gnarled branches and thick roots made it an imposing figure against the night sky. The women placed their baskets gently on the ground before the tree. They then stepped back and began to chant softly, their voices mingling with the rustling of the leaves and the distant murmur of the river. Their prayers were inaudible to me, but the reverence in their tone was unmistakable. After they finished their prayers, they picked up the empty baskets and turned to leave. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if the act of leaving was part of a ritual itself. Later they used disappear in darkness. The baskets were always full of baked meat, fruits, vegetables, and flatbread, but I could not shake the feeling that something more significant was happening there. The women's actions, the silent prayers, and the solemnity with which they performed their ritual created an atmosphere of deep mystery and unease. The cemetery, with its ancient graves and overgrown vegetation, seemed to hold its breath in the presence of their rituals. I returned to the village each time, with more questions than answers. The sight of the banyan tree and the echoes of the woman's prayers lingering in my mind. It was clear that whatever was taking place at that tree was tied to the house and its inhabitants, but the full extent of the mystery remained just out of reach. A few days after my latest observation of the two women's ritual, I was spending time with my friends in the village, enjoying the carefree days of summer. We played games in the fields and shared stories under the shade of the banyan tree. It was during one of these lazy afternoons that an old disheveled man came shuffling down the village path. His clothes were tattered and stained, and his hair hung in unkempt strands around his face. He had a wild look in his eyes, and his mutterings were often incoherent, giving him an unsettling presence. The villagers referred to him as the Old Lunatic. He was known to wander the village, mumbling to himself about strange things and occasionally ranting about the family living in the big house. His words were always vague and fragmented, making it difficult to discern any clear meaning from his ramblings. On this particular day, he seemed especially agitated, his voice rising in a fervent tirade as he spoke of the family and a man who had died long ago. Intrigued, I asked my friends about him. They told me that he was a homeless man who lived in the village temple, a place where people provided him with clothes and food out of pity. His past was a topic of hushed whispers and half-forgotten tales. According to the stories, he had once been a servant for the head of that mysterious family who had died decades ago. The family's patriarch was a figure of old, almost mythic proportions in the village. A man and his family member's death had left a shadow over the house. As I listened to my friends, I felt a growing sense of unease. The old lunatic's connection to the family and his cryptic references to their secrets seemed to add another layer to the mystery that had been haunting me. I wondered if the old man's ramblings held any truth or if they were merely the product of a troubled mind. His erratic behavior and fragmented stories only deepened the enigma surrounding the family and their darkened house. That evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows over the village, I found myself reflecting on everything I had learned. The old man's vague but persistent mentions of the family, combined with the eerie rituals performed by the two women, left me with a growing sense of foreboding. It seemed as though the more I uncovered, the more the village and its secrets remained stubbornly out of reach, wrapped in a shroud of mystery and silence. A few days after the old lunatic's cryptic rantings about the family, I was on my way to school ground, where we used to play football. That old lunatic came in my way. His wild eyes locked onto mine, and he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. In a hoarse, urgent whisper, he warned me to stay away from the family and not to follow them. He hinted that he had seen me on the night I had followed the women to the cemetery, though he never let on how he had known. His warning left me shaken, especially since the family was a topic no one spoke of, and it was unsettling to realize that someone had noticed my secret excursions. Despite his warnings, my curiosity only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something crucial I was missing, something that connected all the strange occurrences in the village. So, a few days later, when I headed to the river for a quiet day of fishing, I was startled to see the old lunatic there as well. He was sitting by the riverbank, seemingly lost in thought, but as soon as he saw me, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of recognition and concern. I approached him cautiously, my fishing gear in hand. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "And why did you stop me the other day? What's so dangerous about the family?" The old man looked around to ensure no one else was within earshot before he began to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he seemed to struggle to find the right words. But there was a desperation in his tone that made me listen intently. "That family, they're not like the others," he began, his eyes darting nervously. "They've been involved in things, dark things. The house, the rituals, it's all connected. You saw the women going to the cemetery, didn't you?" I nodded, my heart racing. "They make offerings there," he continued, "but not just for the dead. They're trying to appease something ancient, something that demands a price for peace. The man who died the head of the family, he made a pact with it long ago, and the rituals are meant to keep it at bay. The food, the prayers, they're all part of a bargain that was made." The old lunatic's words sent a chill down my spine. The idea that the family was involved in something sinister, and that their rituals were meant to keep an ancient evil at bay, was both terrifying and fascinating. The old man's warnings and his fragmented story painted a picture of a family trapped in a dark pact, bound by forces beyond their control. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because you need to stay away," he said, his gaze intense. "I saw you that night, and I've been trying to warn you. If you get too close, you might become part of their bargain too. There's a reason they keep to themselves and why no one speaks of them. Some things are better left alone." The old man's warning left me deeply unsettled, but my curiosity was far from sated. I pressed him for more information, desperate to understand the full extent of the mystery surrounding the family and their rituals. He sighed heavily, his eyes looking distant as if he was trying to recall events buried under years of neglect. "The house wasn't always like this," he began slowly. "Decades ago, it was just a normal, prosperous home. I was a servant there. The head of the house, he was a good man once, but he was consumed by greed. He had 3 daughters and 4 sons, and he was incredibly wealthy." The old man's voice grew more intense. He loved to spend money, and he spent it lavishly. But his greed and poor planning led to disaster. He lost everything. When it came time for his daughters to marry, he begged the villagers for help, promising he'd repay them once he had the chance. He borrowed from many people, but after the weddings, he never paid back a single penny. He drank heavily and offered excuses, but the truth was, he had no intention of repaying anyone. His eyes grew darker as he recounted the tale. The villagers stopped associating with him. They cut him off. One night, while returning from the fields, he noticed something strange near the banyan tree by the cemetery. There was a strange, eerie glow coming from beneath it. Curious and desperate, he approached it. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. He found an old ornate box buried beneath the tree. When he opened it, he discovered a cache of ancient gold and silver coins, their surfaces etched with mysterious symbols. As soon as his fingers touched the coins, a chilling apparition emerged from the box. The ghost was ghastly and skeletal, its eyes hollow and its presence emanating a palpable malevolence. The old man shuddered. The head of the house was terrified, but the ghost spoke in a voice that was both haunting and persuasive. It told him not to be afraid, and explained that it was bound to the coins, locked away for years. The ghost offered the coins to the man, but demanded a grim bargain in return. The old man's face was pale as he continued. The ghost required that every new moon, the man must provide offerings of food at the cemetery, left at the banyan tree. In exchange, the ghost would allow him to keep the wealth. But there was a dire warning. If the man failed to fulfill this requirement, the ghost would exact a terrible revenge. It would kill him and his family members in increasingly horrific ways, one each year, until they were all dead. The old man sighed deeply. The man accepted the bargain and began performing the rituals. For a few months, he fulfilled the ghost's demands faithfully. With the wealth, he bought a huge field and built a grand house, away from the village where his family lived. He spent lavishly on his sons' weddings and indulged their every desire. But the greed that had driven him never truly left. The old man said, his voice growing somber. He began to skip some of the new moon offerings, thinking that the ghost had forgotten or that he was free from the pact. For a while, nothing happened. But the ghost's vengeance was not so easily forgotten. The old man's face was grim as he recounted the consequences. One year, his youngest grandson, a bright and lively child, was discovered dead in a well. It was a horrific sight. The well had been dry for months. But when the boy was found, his lifeless body was submerged in the murky water. His family was devastated, but the cause of his death was shrouded in mystery. There were no signs of foul play or accident, only the eerie, unnatural stillness of the boy's body in the well. He continued, his voice trembling with the weight of his tale. The following year, the man's eldest son met a gruesome fate. His body was discovered in a ghastly state. His head had been found, but the rest of his remains were nowhere to be seen. The head was left in a grotesque display, with a look of sheer terror frozen on his face. The search for the rest of his body was fruitless. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. The local authorities were baffled, and rumors of supernatural retribution began to spread. The old man's expression grew darker. Each time the man failed to honor the bargain, the ghost's retribution grew more terrible and more personal. The deaths were not random. They were a reflection of the ghost's wrath, and a warning to the man that the pact was far from over. The man's attempts to evade the ghost's demands only deepened the curse, ensuring that his family would continue to suffer for his broken promises. The old man's eyes were filled with sadness as he continued. In his desperation and madness, the man took his own life. He jumped from a cliff, and his body was found in pieces at the base. His death was a grim testament to the ghost's relentless vengeance and his own broken spirit. The widow, now left alone, revealed the truth to her remaining son and the old servant. She told them the full tale of the ghost and the cursed pact. The old servant, fearing for his own life, fled to ensure his safety. Initially, no one believed the widow's story. It seemed too far-fetched, too impossible to be true. The old man's voice grew somber, but within 6 months, the truth became all too real. The widow and her remaining son were found dead in the fields. Both were hanged from a tree, their bodies left in a grotesque display. The fields where they were discovered were eerily quiet, and the sight of their lifeless forms hanging from the branches sent a shiver through the village. The old man's voice grew even more somber. As the deaths and misfortunes continued, the villagers began to believe that the family was cursed. They cut off all connections with them, refusing to speak or interact with anyone from the house. The once proud family was now shunned and isolated, their name whispered only in hushed, fearful tones. The old man paused before continuing. The youngest son of the man, understanding the gravity of their situation and the unrelenting curse that had claimed so many lives, decided to take drastic measures. He isolated the entire family from the outside world, ensuring they had no contact with the village or anyone beyond their own walls. The youngest son knew that if there was any chance of breaking the curse and saving his remaining family, his brother, his nieces and nephews, and his sisters-in-law, he needed to take action. He approached the ghost with a desperate plea. He offered to return whatever wealth remained, hoping it might appease the spirit. In his desperation, he promised to fulfill any demands the ghost might have, hoping it would spare his remaining family. The ghost agreed, but with conditions. The two women of the family had to provide food for the spirit on every new moon night for the next 2 years. The youngest son had to be there on the last new moon day. The ghost's demands were not modest. It required the offerings to be in large quantities. The son had to ensure that the food was abundant and unceasing, as a way to satisfy the ghost's insatiable hunger and maintain the tenuous bargain. The youngest son accepted the terms. For the next 2 years, he dedicated himself to the ghost's demands. Each new moon, his wife and sister-in-laws would prepare and deliver the vast quantities of food required by the spirit, hoping that these offerings would be sufficient to lift the curse and save his surviving family from further tragedy. The old man's tale ended with a note of grim determination. Despite the son's efforts and the sacrifices he made, the shadow of the curse loomed over the family. The weight of their past actions and the ghost's relentless hunger served as a stark reminder of the cost of greed and the consequences of broken promises. As I listened to the old man's story, the chilling reality of the family's plight became all too clear. The curse had transformed their lives into a nightmare of isolation and fear, and the youngest son's desperate attempts to atone for his family's sins highlighted the dark legacy left by their patriarch's fateful pact. The old man's tale lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over the quiet village and its dark history. The youngest son's tireless efforts to appease the ghost continued for 2 long years. Each new moon, he meticulously prepared and delivered the food, hoping to atone for the sins of his family and lift the curse that had plagued them. As the final new moon approached, the son faced the weight of his responsibility with a heavy heart. He made his way to the cemetery one last time, placing the final offering before the ancient banyan tree. The oppressive silence of the night and the cold wind seemed to carry an ominous promise. The ghost appeared, its presence as chilling as ever. The youngest son, worn and desperate, awaited the spirit's response. The eerie glow that had long haunted the cemetery faded, and with it, the ghost's menacing form. The darkness lifted, signaling the end of the curse. In the days that followed, the village saw a change. The house that had once been a symbol of fear and misfortune now stood quietly, its dark legacy seemingly behind it. The surviving family members, though forever marked by their ordeal, began to slowly reintegrate into the village. The once shunned house became a reminder of the high cost of greed and broken promises. The youngest son lived out the rest of his days with a deep sense of remorse and a commitment to honor those lost. Though the family's fortunes were not restored, they found a measure of peace and a chance to rebuild their lives in the shadow of their past mistakes. As for me, the chilling account of the cursed family left an indelible mark. The village with its haunted past and the ominous house on the outskirts became a place I could never return to. The weight of the story, coupled with the eerie atmosphere that clung to the place, ensured that I never set foot in that village again. The banyan tree by the cemetery stood as a silent witness to the family's trials, a stark reminder of the price of greed and the enduring impact of a broken pact. The tale of the curse became a dark legend, passed down through whispers and hushed conversations. The ghost's retribution had come to an end, but its shadow lingered, a somber reminder of the consequences of actions taken in darkness. And so, the village and its haunted house faded into memory, leaving behind a legacy of both horror and redemption. with the echoes of a tragic past lingering in the quiet fields and the silent shadows of the banyan tree.